at the second chapter of the book of Zephaniah, a minor prophet Zephaniah. We had a lesson on Zephaniah chapter 1 a few months ago. I forget how long exactly. And I promised then a follow-up, and so this is that follow-up. There'll be another follow-up when we cover Zephaniah chapter 3, if I ever get around to it. I appreciate Mark's, primarily most of the songs we had talk about judgment, which I guess is fitting, since Zephaniah is mostly about, judgment. There aren't a lot of hymns that specifically quote from Zephaniah. One of the songs we sang tonight, Prepare to Meet Thy God, is actually a quote from Amos chapter 4. I tried to write a hymn years ago based on something in Zephaniah. And I wrote lyrics, and I wasn't happy with them. And I never wrote music, so it's a dead project that's sitting on a computer somewhere. Should have finished it, but oh well. I guess it's too late now for it to be of use for this lesson. But someday. Maybe. Zephaniah, as we noted in a previous lesson, some of the things I'll say up front will be kind of more by way of review. Zephaniah was part of the royal family. He was the great-grandson of King Hezekiah. And he likely prophesied during the time of Josiah, who was also the great-grandson of King Hezekiah. We're not able to pinpoint precisely when in his reign he was operating. But seeing as how he talks about the fall of Nineveh in chapter 2, it seems to have been, around maybe shortly before or somewhat before even what has taken place here, possibly during the reign of the Assyrian Emperor Ashurbanipal from 668 to 627. The main thing that Zephaniah is concerned with is this day of the Lord. A day when God breaks into human history and changes things, saves the righteous, destroys the wicked. And anytime you read the prophets and they talk about the day of the Lord, there's always kind of this intertwining of those two themes, that the wicked are going to be judged and that the righteous are going to be vindicated. And sometimes one theme is emphasized more than the other, but Zephaniah really kind of deals with both. God's people, they always wanted to see themselves as the good guys in that story. They always wanted to see themselves as the righteous folks that got vindicated. And more often than not, what happened was the reverse was true. Too often, I think that the problem was that they wanted to make it my day instead of the Lord's day, the day of the Lord. And it's all well and good to make it your day. The problem is, at the end, that God will eventually intervene in human affairs and show you that it was never your day to begin with. It was always God's day. And so chapter 1 of Zephaniah primarily addressed Judah, this nation, the southern kingdom of Judah. But even there you have hints of judgment. God is going to bring judgment on the whole creation. Chapter 1 and verse 2, I will completely remove all things from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. I will remove man and beast. I will remove the birds of the sky, the fish of the sea, the ruins, along with the wicked. I will cut off man from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. So kind of this language of judgment on the world, it's specifically applied to Judah as you get into the chapter. But you've got this language of almost this decreation. God is unmaking the world, going back to the beginning and undoing the works from the beginning. And so chapter 1 was primarily about, how these inhabitants of the earth, but more specifically the inhabitants of the land of Judah, the ones that needed to watch out because God was coming in judgment. And we come to Zephaniah 2. What's going on in this chapter? At first glance, Zephaniah 2 looks like what we would call oracles against the nations. And you probably heard me talk about this before, but I'll go over it again. Most of the Old Testament prophets, or many of the Old Testament prophets, have a whole section in their book devoted to oracles against Gentile nations. Isaiah 13 through 27 is a whole block of text dealing with Babylon, Assyria, Philistia, Moab, Damascus, Egypt, the wilderness of the sea, the valley of vision, Tyre, and eventually a section on a generic world city. Jeremiah 46 through 51, another block of text dealing with the Gentile nations. Jeremiah deals with Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Edom, Damascus, Kedar, Hazor, Elam, and most prominently Babylon. And then Ezekiel also does something similar. Ezekiel 25 through 32, another huge block of text, which Ezekiel 25 addresses Ammon, Moab, Edom, and Philistia. And then he spends the rest of his time talking about Tyre and Egypt, and spends a lot of time dealing with those two nations in Ezekiel 25 through 32. And the minor prophets, they do the same thing, kind of, but there's little differences here and there. The book of Obadiah, for instance, the entire book of Obadiah is about Edom. The book of Nahum, the entire book of Nahum is about Nineveh. Jonah goes and preaches to Nineveh, but you get the impression reading Jonah that the lesson is actually for Israel, who needs to learn about their treatment of the Gentile nations. Joel 3 talks about gathering various nations together, but it appears to be an apocalyptic type text that's designed to talk primarily to Judah again. And perhaps most prominently, Amos chapter 1 and 2, where Amos has a bunch of short oracles against a bunch of Gentile nations, but the whole point of it isn't to criticize those nations. The whole point of it is to say to Israel, you're just as bad. In fact, you're even worse because you should have known better. So Amos was using his oracles against the nation to set up a rhetorical point about how Israel is worse than all other nations. So those are just various ways in which prophets use oracles against Gentile nations. So what's Zephaniah doing? In Zephaniah chapter 2, the prophet addresses Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Cush, Assyria, and then we're going to see an unspecified city, which we'll talk about that when we get to it. But I think we're at least justified in asking the question if these are oracles against the nations in the traditional sense that we would think of them. Let's read. Beginning in verse 1, "Gather yourselves together, yes, gather, O nation without shame, before the decree takes effect. The day passes like the chaff, before the burning anger of the Lord comes upon you, before the day of the Lord's anger comes upon you. Seek the Lord, all you humble of the earth who have carried out His ordinances. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger." If we ignore the chapter divisions, he's clearly addressing Judah when he says that, actually, in terms of addressing the Lord and seeking the Lord. But then in verse 4, he says, "For Gaza will be abandoned, and Ashkelon a desolation. Ashdod will be driven out at noon, and Ekron will be uprooted. Woe to the inhabitants of the seacoast, the nation of the Kerethites. The word of the Lord is against you, O Canaan, land of the Philistines. I will destroy you, so that there will be no inhabitant. So the seacoast will be pastures, with caves for shepherds and folds for flocks. And the coast will be for the remnant of the house of Judah. They will pasture on it in the houses of Ashkelon. They will lie down at evening, for the Lord their God will care for them and restore their fortunes." So what's happened is now all of a sudden we have a very abrupt transition to talking to these other places: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron. Now, we're looking at that. Verses 1 through 3 is primarily about the proper response to judgment. Nation without shame needs to gather themselves together, and they need to humble themselves before the decree of the Lord, before God's decree of judgment takes effect. The day is passing like chaff. The burning anger of Yahweh is coming upon them. So they have a call. They need to seek God. God had promised in chapter 1 and verse 6 to stretch out His hand against those who did not seek Him. Well, here in chapter 2 and verse 3, it is those who are the humble of the earth who truly seek Lord. It fits with the teaching of Jesus, the kingdom of God. It doesn't belong to the proud ones. It doesn't belong to the ones who lift up their hearts and exalt themselves. It belongs to the meek who inherit the earth. It belongs to the poor in spirit, of whom Jesus says, "Theirs is the kingdom of heaven." They must seek righteousness and humility, and perhaps they might be protected. Verse 3 ends with a big perhaps. Perhaps you will be hidden in the day of Yahweh's anger. That whole perhaps, there's a lot of people in the Bible that use the word perhaps when they speak of God's actions, because, everything God does needs to be qualified with a perhaps. Because God does as He pleases. He's not required by us to act a certain way. God is not required to do what we want Him to do. And so part of the humility that this text is talking about is not presuming to make God's decisions for Him. It's a humility that we can learn from. It's one thing to point to what God has said and said, yes, this is what God has said. But it's another thing to speculate about things that God hasn't specifically talked about. And, brethren want to speculate about, well, this specific individual over here, will he go to heaven or will he go to hell? Well, that's judgment. That's God's end of the stick. We can't speak for God except where God has spoken. So, and we can't speak regarding anything except in the terms of perhaps the Lord will have mercy. Perhaps we will be hidden in the day of Yahweh's anger. But what's the deal with these oracles against the nations? Judgments on the nations. We'll start with verses 4 through 7, which we just read, with Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron. And this is one of those things we're clearly talking about. These are all Philistine cities. There are 5 Philistine cities in the Bible: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ekron, Ashdod, and Gath. Only 4 of them are mentioned here, though. Gath gets left out a lot of times in the prophets, and the reason for it is probably because Gath was destroyed during the reign of Uzziah. You get hints of that Amos 6 and verse 2, and 2 Chronicles 26 and verse 6. And so most of the prophets only mention 4 Philistine cities. He says in verse 5, "Woe to the inhabitants of the coast." Woe! Woe is this kind of exclamatory Hebrew phrase. Sometimes denotes condemnation. Sometimes it's just an exclamation like "alas." It signals the beginning of the oracle proper. And he's addressing these inhabitants of the sea coast. Well, the Philistines lived on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, so that's who he's talking to, clearly. He calls them the Kerethites, which Kerethites is a word for Cretans, because the Philistines are thought to have migrated from the island of Crete. And, this is something I think we sometimes forget. Philistines were not natives of the land of Canaan. They migrated there. In fact, God is the one who claims He's responsible for their migration. Amos chapter 9 and verse 7 says, to Israel, "Are you not as the sons of Ethiopia to me, O sons of Israel, declares the Lord? Have I not brought up Israel from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir?" God says, the Arameans and the Philistines had their own kind of exodus, which I brought them to this land. Israel, you're not as special as you think you are. It's the point that he's making there. But even though the Philistines are not natives to the land of Canaan, what is perplexing or fascinating is in verse 5 that Canaan is called the land of the Philistines. And there's an association with Canaan and the Philistines that goes back a long way, even to Genesis. Genesis chapter 10, verse 19, talks about the territory of the Canaanite. Well, that is not the correct verse. That is not the correct verse I meant. I don't know what the correct verse is. Alright, and then of course we are also reminded of the Canaanites in terms of Genesis 9 and verse 25, the curse of Noah, then against them. He said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers." The Philistines, by becoming inhabitants of Canaan, have brought themselves under a curse of sorts. Which, in the back of your head, you're wondering, well, wait, wasn't Israel also brought to the land of Canaan? So doesn't that curse also apply to them as well? No. Zephaniah doesn't address that directly, but the way he words this does provoke the question a little bit. God will destroy the Philistines, and there will no longer be any inhabitant in their land. And verses 6 and 7 kind of describe a transformation of the territory. Verse 6, the coast of the sea will be turned into pastures. The shepherds will live in the caves with their flocks. In verse 7, it will be given to Judah. And the Philistine houses will become Judean barns for housing the flocks. The house of Judah possesses the houses of Ashkelon. The remnant will pasture their flocks there. Here we have the Philistine cities. They're completely taken over by the Judeans. Now, what do we do with that? Well, let's set that aside for now, except to note that the oracle against the Philistines has something to say to Israel. Let's turn our attention to the oracle against Moab and Ammon in verses 8 through 11. I have heard the taunting of Moab and the revilings of the sons of Ammon with which they have taunted my people and become arrogant against their territory. Therefore, as I live, declares the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, surely Moab will be like Sodom and the sons of Ammon like Gomorrah, a place possessed by nettles and salt pits and a perpetual desolation. The remnant of my people will plunder them, and the remainder of my nation will inherit them. This they will have in return for their pride, because they have taunted and become arrogant against the people of the Lord of hosts. The Lord will be terrifying to them, for He will starve all the gods of the earth, and all the coastlands of the nations will bow down to Him, everyone from his own place. Okay, so now we have Moab and Ammon. What were Moab and Ammon? Moab and Ammon were nations that were descended from Lot. And Genesis 19 describes the story of how after Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, Lot and his daughters, the only survivors, they went into a cave, and his daughters got him drunk, and they had children with him, and they named the children Moab and Ben-Ami, which Moab means from the father, and Ben-Ami means son of my people, which later became Ammon. So that's kind of, imagine having that name forever and ever. Moab, from the father. Just a reminder of the behavior of these people. But there were also neighboring nations that lived to the east of Israel, on the other side of the Jordan. And throughout Israel's history, Moab and Ammon were always getting into fights with Israel. There was a constant conflict going on. But in verse 8, God says He's heard their tauntings and their revilings and their arrogance. I think Moab and Ammon were a little bit related to the Israelites, and yet they have not even been a little bit brotherly in their behavior. And the Lord has heard their tauntings. The world does not mock the people of God without God's knowledge. It's not like He's out of earshot or not paying attention or something. It's not like He's planning to ignore it forever. He's planning judgment. He's planning vindication. He's planning to redeem His people. He's planning to judge and to make things right. And so the condemnation given in verse 9 is that Moab and Ammon will become like Sodom and Gomorrah. How appropriate. The two nations conceived in the wake of Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction now return to the place where they were conceived. The desolation and the salt pits become of those cities of the plain. And in verse 7, in verse 11, I'm getting my numbers wrong. In verse 9, the remnant of my people will plunder them. A reminder of what we saw in verse 7. Similar to how the Israelites possess the homes and the lands of the Philistines, they also possess the plunder and the spoil of Moab and Ammon as well. So you kind of see that parallel being set up, that Moab and Ammon fall so that Israel can get their stuff. And the reason given in verse 10, they taunted the people of God. In verse 11, kind of an interesting image, God will starve all the gods of the earth. Kind of a fascinating idea. The pagans believed that their gods needed sacrifices for food. Unlike Yahweh claims in Psalm 50 that He doesn't need this. If I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you. I can go get my own food because the cattle on 1,000 hills are mine. What's happened here, this starving of the gods, also recalls an idea from chapter 1. That the day of the Lord is near, in which the Lord has prepared a sacrifice, consecrated His guests. In the day of the Lord's sacrifice, He will punish the princes and the king's sons who clothe themselves in foreign garments. Here we have this idea. God has prepared a sacrifice. He's prepared a feast. But the false gods will not be able to enjoy the food. They will not be invited. It exploits a key weakness in the pagan system here. These gods, these false gods, are reliant on human beings for their provision. But Yahweh, He does not need us. It's not served by human hands as if He needed anything. On the contrary, it is within Him that we live and move and exist. He will starve all the gods of the earth. All the coastlands of the nations will bow down to Him. part of God's ultimate goal. Gather all the nations to himself, to make every knee bow and every tongue confess, to get the whole world to eventually submit to God's rule. It's the result of humility, of course. The beginning of the chapter is a call to be humble, but who ultimately provokes all of this great submission of the nations to God? Well, it's Jesus, the one who humbled himself to the point of death. The whole world will eventually kneel and bow to God and submit to God's rule. Christ humbled himself so that God would exalt him. Now God expects the nations to humble themselves before him. This is a theme that we keep coming back to in Zephaniah. And again, we note, as with Philistia, so with Moab and Ammon, the promise is made to benefit the remnant of God's people. Now we come to verses 12 through 15. And this is a bit of an odd one. An oracle of judgment on Cush and Assyria. You also, O Cushites, will be slain by my sword. And he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria. He will make Nineveh a desolation, parched like the wilderness. Flocks will lie down in her midst. All beasts which range in herds, both the pelican and the hedgehog, will lodge in the tops of her pillars. Birds will sing in the window. Desolation will be on the threshold, for he has laid bare the cedar work. This is the exultant city which dwells securely, who says in her heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. How she has become a desolation, a resting place for beasts. Everyone who passes by her will hiss and wave his hand in contempt. So that doesn't sound fun. Now, a note on verse 12, the Cushites. The New American Standard translates it as the Ethiopians, which is usually what Cush refers to. Bible. So a lot of times you see the word Cush in the Bible. They translate it Ethiopia or Ethiopians. But there's another thought that some have suggested here, that Zephaniah, and I think that this has a lot to commend it based on the context. In Genesis chapter 10, the table of the nations, one of the sons of Ham was Cush. The sons of Cush were Seba and Havilah and Sabta and Rama and Sabtika. The sons of Rama were Sheba and Dedan. But then verse 8, Cush became the father of Nimrod. Nimrod became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babylon and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh and Rehoboth-ir and Calah. Now, you start reading in Zephaniah 2 and verse 12, you Cushites will be slain, and the Lord's going to stretch out his hand against Assyria and Nineveh. And you're just like, he's switching between two sides of the map here. Or maybe he's using Cushites to refer to some of Cush's actual descendants who were involved in the construction of Nineveh. Which would make sense if you know what Genesis 10 says on that point. To keep the oracle consistent, it might actually make more sense to read Cushites as a criticism of the Assyrians rather than the Ethiopians. Now, the dispersed ones in exile in chapter 3 and verse 10 are also said to be beyond the river Cush, which makes sense because the dispersed ones who were in exile at that time were exiled where? Assyrians to Assyria. So, Zephaniah might be using the word Cush in a way that's a little different than the other prophets use him. The point, of course, is that he's stretching out his hand against the north and destroying Assyria, Nineveh. The city is, verses 13 and 14, reduced to a wilderness. The flocks lie down in her midst. All the beasts of the nations inhabit her. Pelicans and hedgehogs lodge in her pillars. Birds sing in the windows. Cedar is laid bare. Why is this the way that God describes the judgment on their city? Singing birds, resting beasts, pelicans. It's like, you think of kind of a strange thing. The pelicans are coming to get you. Well, the point is that the city is populated by animals because no humans live there anymore. Imagine if you came to a city like, say, New York, And you found that the only things there were birds in the windows and cattle in the streets, and there were no businesses open, and there were no people walking, and there were no cars driving, and none of the normal business and busyness that we associate with city life was going on. You might think something's a little wrong here. What happened? Some people might say, well, that would never happen. That city's too busy. It's too prosperous. There's too much going on. People consider New York important. It would never happen. You know what? They said the same thing about Nineveh. It'll never happen here. I mean, Nineveh's never going to be populated by pelicans and hedgehogs. We're the capital of the world. We're the great bustling economic center. What does God say? Well, God says Nineveh is going to become more like a ghost town in which nobody lives. It's not going to be anybody there. Because that's the way cities of men work. They don't last forever. No matter how unsurmountable you think they are. This is the exultant city. Or perhaps verse 15, is this the exultant city who dwells securely? She says in her heart, I am. There is no one besides me. Those are the words that were on the lips of Babylon in Isaiah chapter 47 and verses 7 and 8. I am, and there is no one besides me. But she has to reckon with the actual I am, whom there really is no one besides. As a result of that, well, there are going to be other people besides her. She is too arrogant when it comes to her own self-worth. The city that dared to think she was the most important in the world becomes a desolation. It becomes a resting place for animals. Everybody who passes by her hisses at her. She becomes the target of taunts. In language, everyone who passes by will hiss and wave his hand in contempt. Because at verse 13, God stretches out His hand, and after God stretches out His hand, everybody else waves their hand. You're inconsequential. Now, another thing to note in passing, of course, is how she is the target of taunts, language that is later used of Jerusalem in Lamentations chapter 2 and verse 15. Where the prophet writes, all who pass along the way clap their hands in derision at you. They hiss and shake their heads at the daughter of Jerusalem. Is this the city of which they said the perfection of beauty? Joy to all the earth? The world gets amazed every time something like this happens, every time some great city falls. People of God have no reason to be surprised because there's only one city that will endure, and it is the city of the living God. Now, before we move into the next part, I want to note just a couple of things in passing. That Zephaniah is very conscious of what's going on in the book of Genesis. You have, of course, his association between Moab and Ammon and Sodom and Gomorrah. You have his association between words like coastlands and nations, something you get from reading in Genesis 10 and verse 5. You have the association between Cush and Nineveh, which wouldn't know that without reading Genesis chapter 10, and nobody ever reads Genesis 10. And when you pair that with the creation and decreation language in chapter 1, Zephaniah really seems to want us to remember what happened in the book of Genesis. And in the next chapter, there's going to be a bunch of allusions to Genesis chapter 11. But I want to focus on just this one in particular, chapter 3 and verses 1 through 7. Which, this is probably not a great chapter division, but it's hard to know where to put them. Chapter 3. Woe to her who is rebellious and defiled, the tyrannical city. She heeded no voice. She accepted no instruction. She did not trust in the Lord. She did not draw near to her God. Her princes within her are roaring lions. Her judges are wolves at evening. They leave nothing for morning. Her prophets are reckless, treacherous men. Her priests have profaned the sanctuary. They have done violence to the law. The Lord is righteous within her. He will do no injustice. Every morning He brings His justice to light. He does not fail. But the unjust knows no shame. I have cut off nations. Their corner towers are in ruins. I have made their streets desolate, with no one passing by. Their cities are laid waste without a man, without an inhabitant. I said, surely you will revere me. Accept instruction, so her dwelling will not be cut off according to all that I have appointed concerning her. They were eager to corrupt all their deeds. So here we have the word woe again in verse 1. We have this rebellious, tyrannical city. And he doesn't name the city. Who is this city? Well, now, again, if we ignore chapter divisions, like I frequently encourage us to do, it might look like he's talking about Nineveh, because since that's the most recent city he mentioned in verse 15 of chapter, in verse 13 of chapter 2. She's the exultant city of 2:15. But does it make sense to read this city as Nineveh? Well, you start reading chapter 3, and the analogy starts to break down a little bit. You listen to the characteristics of this city. She did not accept instruction. She did not trust Yahweh. She did not draw near to her God. Her princes are lions and her judges are wolves. Her prophets are reckless and treacherous. How many prophets were wandering around Nineveh? Maybe Jonah or something. I don't know. Her priests have defiled her sanctuary. They're probably not talking about the Ninevite priests of the Syrian gods. Her priests have also done violence to the law. Probably not talking about Hammurabi's code there. We're talking about the law in the sense of the law of Moses. Does this city sound like Nineveh to you? Does it sound like Jerusalem? It fits the situation in Josiah's day. The priests had not cared for the sanctuary. They had it wasn't that they had done violence to the law. They'd actually gone so far as to lose the book of the law. What do we do with that? Now, Zephaniah didn't signal when he changed the subject, unless you think that the word woe is a change of subject. The immediate context suggests he's talking about Nineveh, but the priest and prophet references suggest he's talking about Jerusalem. So naturally, if you pick up any two books on Zephaniah, you're going to get two different suggestions because no one can agree. Is it talking about Nineveh? Is it talking about Jerusalem? Why not both? Rather than either or, why not both and? Maybe Zephaniah is being ambiguous on purpose. Maybe he does this on purpose to get us to think a little bit. Because just like the oracle against Philistia primarily had things to say to Israel, and just like the oracle against Moab and Ammon primarily had things to say to Israel, the oracle against Nineveh, pretty sure that wasn't just for Nineveh. It wasn't just for their benefit. The prophet Isaiah spoke about a contrast between two cities in this world. A world city that is wicked and a holy city that is righteous. And the folks in Jerusalem, when they heard this oracle against Nineveh, they're the wicked city. We're the righteous city. We're the good city. We're the good guys who are going to be vindicated on the day of the Lord. But Zephaniah comes along and he says, you think you're the good city? You're the rebellious city. You're the tyrannical city. Your holiness is a farce because you don't listen to instruction. The only truly righteous one, verse 5, is Yahweh, who does no injustice, who never fails. Jeremiah later writes in Lamentations chapter 3, in verses 22 and 23. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. With the unjust, they know no shame. They are that nation without shame, as mentioned in 2 and verse 1. God has cut off the nations, cut off their corner towers. His day has been recognized against the fortresses, against the citadels, against the powerful, unbreakable bases, military might. And the streets, in verse 6, they're made desolate. The population has vanished, disappeared. In a way, Zephaniah is kind of like a parable because he takes a historical event like the fall of Nineveh. It's coming up on the horizon. But let me tell you something, Judah. Cautionary tale. The judgment on Nineveh isn't something that's just them. You don't see that coming. You're not going to see it coming when the Lord comes for you. It can be your fate as well. And dare I say, could it be a lesson for us today too? a cautionary tale for us. Christians might think of themselves as a light in the darkness, guide to the blind. But if we do not watch ourselves, if we do not maintain our faithfulness, we can become the very darkness we profess to preach against. We who have come to Zion, the city of the living God, may realize that at some point we got misdirected, took a wrong turn, wound up in a different city. A city that pretends to be Zion, a city that pretends to be the city of God, but in reality is just another man-made, tyrannical, rebellious city that refuses to accept instruction. Watch yourself, that you do not lose what we have accomplished. The city that accepts no instruction in verse 2 must learn to accept instruction in verse 7. She must learn to fear and revere the Lord so that her dwelling is not cut off. Now, verse 7 doesn't seem particularly optimistic that Judah is going to get around to it. And history tells us what happened. Judah had a little repentance in the days of Josiah. But after Josiah died, that was it. The Egyptians and then the Babylonians came, and then that was the end for Judah. It's a lesson for us too. What can happen if we do not seek the Lord, if we do not humble ourselves before Him? How do we keep ourselves as the holy city of God? Just humble ourselves, seek the Lord, learn to accept instruction. But of course, Zephaniah is not over yet. His doom and gloom message has a message of hope, which we will talk about when we get the remainder of chapter 3. This evening, take out your songbooks as we come to the conclusion of this lesson. If there's anything, the prophets speak against pride a lot. And Zephaniah, in particular, you'll notice, has a lot to say about it as well. If we're going to humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God so that He can exalt us, we need to be willing to take a good, honest look at ourselves, our lives, and our hearts. It's so easy, to read a scripture, or to hear a lesson, to read an article, or to do anything and see how it applies to the other person who's next to me, see how it applies to my neighbor, and how much better a person my neighbor could be if he would just listen to this information. But that's not why the scripture was written, so that we could use it to browbeat others into submission. It was written to pierce our hearts. Us personally, each and every one of us individually, need to take a good hard look at our own lives. And say, well, what does this have to say to me? What is Zephaniah saying in my case? Because otherwise, if we see it simply as a book for others, if we see it as, those Moabites and those Ammonites and those Philistines, they were such bad people, we need more preaching against people like that, we miss the real lesson of Zephaniah. A lesson to convict the hearts of the Israelites, the people of God, who should have been listening and should have been accepting instruction. If you're here tonight, you feel like you need some help or some encouragement in accepting instruction, humbling yourself before the Lord, now, of course, is an appropriate time to make that known and to seek encouragement from your brethren. All together we stand and we sing Song Select.